As I think we're all aware that we're maybe a bit tired of being on Zoom. And so I'm really hoping that my talk is a bit of a change of pace for you and will be entertaining, but you learn something. And so as I was asking God, how could I spice things up, let's say, how I felt God say, well, what did Jesus do? How did Jesus teach? And Jesus often taught in parables. And so this is my take on a modern day parable around fasting. That's all I'm going to say. So I hope you enjoy it. And here we go. A warm welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us tonight on our show, Pathways. As always, I'm your host, C. Ovid. I know, awkward name given our circumstances. As you know, we're continuing in on our series called Jesus's Pathways. And tonight in particular, we're looking at the pathway of fasting. Now, fasting is probably something you've heard of, but maybe you don't know much about it, and that's the exact point of our show this evening. I'm bringing on 3 guests that I'm really hoping will help shed some light on this topic. In particular, our goal is to answer these 2 questions. What is fasting, and why should we do it? So, without any further delay, let's please welcome our first guest. He comes all the way from the 2nd century. Don't ask me how. He comes from the Jewish sect called the Pharisees. Please, let's welcome Phil the Pharisee.
Hi, Phil. Thanks for being here. Hope you found this okay.
Yes, time travel isn't easy. But thank you for having me. I always love an opportunity to display my righteousness.
Anyways, let's get straight to it, Phil. Please, would you share with us your take on fasting?
Sure. So, fasting is voluntarily not consuming food or drink. We, as a Jewish culture, must fast on the Day of Atonement. However, I personally fast twice a week.
Okay, that's interesting, Phil. Would you share a bit more about what the Day of Atonement is?
Sure. The Day of Atonement is the day that the high priest makes a sacrifice to atone for the sins of God's people. We must fast on these days as it signifies our own personal cleansing.
Thanks, Phil. That's really interesting background. So I couldn't help but notice that you just threw in there that you choose to fast twice a week. Do you mind sharing with us why you do that?
Well, fasting is an expectation for someone of my caliber, a requirement if I am to remain in my high standing in the Jewish community and before God. We must follow the law, and fasting proves my devotion to God.
Phil, you bring a very unique perspective. Some might argue ancient. But time is of the essence, and we do need to get on to our next guest. But thank you again for coming all this way. All right, folks, our next guest is a lifestyle coach who cannot get enough of intermittent fasting. Please, would you welcome Rich Calorie? So, Rich, I have a feeling that you are probably going to be on the complete opposite end of the spectrum in terms of our last guest. But please, would you share with us your take on fasting?
Absolutely. Fasting is all about the mind, body, and soul, and cleansing it of toxins and allowing our cells to regenerate. Our bodies are amazing, and fasting helps prove this.
Okay, so how does that look practically for you?
Sure. Well, I'm on a strict diet and intermittent fasting plan. It's not only about what you eat, it's when you eat it. So I fast multiple times a week to get the most out of my body.
Interesting. So, in your mind, fasting is solely the cutting out of food to cleanse your body.
Yes, 1000% yes.
Gotta say, Rich, I admire your enthusiasm, but I'm not 1000% sure that that's exactly what fasting is. I do find it interesting, though, that between our first guest, there are some similarities in that fasting is a means of cleansing our body. But as you can see,
their motivations are completely different. So let's bring out our third guest who hopefully will help us figure this out. Our next guest is a man named Mark Middle, who often finds himself, well, in the middle. He's a millennial that thinks he knows everything, but clearly he doesn't. Let's bring him out. Mark. Yeah, I was just listening backstage to your first two guests, and I just gotta say, I think they're wrong. I mean, fasting was totally something you just had to do before Jesus came. I mean, Jesus came to fulfill the law, so why do we need to fast? And give up food? There's no way I could do that. I'm a self-proclaimed foodie. I mean, isn't fasting just something you do at Lent, like give up chocolate or something? Besides, I have a relationship with Jesus. Isn't that enough, anyways? Well, Mark, you just jumped right in there, didn't you? Interesting thoughts. So, to summarize, you simply think that fasting's irrelevant to you. It's either something that is ancient and no longer practiced, or it's something a select group of people are passionate about, like our good friend Rich. But my follow-up question to you would be, if Jesus came to fulfill the law, why do we then have accounts of Jesus fasting himself? Mark, as you ponder that, we're going to say goodbye to you. Well, you've heard from our three guests and their take on fasting, but as host of the show, I'd love to share my take on the matter. It may be a surprise to hear this, but all of my guests today were paid actors.
C, what are you doing?
Well, it says to pause for laughter. That was one of my big jokes. Are they not laughing? Oh. Anyways, they were all meant to portray what I believe to be misconceptions about what fasting is. Let's take our first guest. He believed fasting to be an ancient practice that was necessary to become right with God. But we know that it was Jesus' blood and sacrifice on the cross that ultimately is what makes us right with God. But there is something to how fasting is a way to deny ourselves as we seek reconciliation with the Father. Our second guest claims that fasting is simply a modern day approach to cleansing or healing our bodies. Now, as someone who has personally experienced the physical benefits of fasting, I have to disagree that it's its only intended purpose. However, God created us and God instituted fasting. So I believe that he knows our bodies and he knows what fasting can physically do for us. So as I have personally learned more about what physically goes on in our bodies when we fast, I find it fascinating the correlation to the cleansing of our mind and soul in fasting as we seek God, but also the physical cleansing of our bodies that fasting can do. It's personally drawn me into deeper relationship of knowing God as my creator. And our third guest was completely indifferent to the matter and felt that fasting didn't apply to him. But I would argue that fasting is relevant for us because Jesus modeled it for us. When we look in the Bible, fasting is most often the intentional withholding of food and sometimes drink for a specific time and purpose. It was a tool to cleanse our bodies as we sought the Lord on certain matters. Although the Bible does most often speak about fasting in terms of food, it doesn't always just reference food. So, for example, in 1 Corinthians, Paul is referencing a quarrel between a husband and wife dealing with sexual temptation, and the encouragement is for them to withhold sex and to pray instead. Now, what that does is it gives greater insight into what it is we should fast from. In this scenario, sex was their big thing clouding their mind, so they should not do that and seek the Lord. So the invitation is to fast from anything that is currently causing a cloudiness in our mind, something that's causing an inability to hear God's voice in our life. So if fasting is a means to cleanse our minds and our soul, then we must ask ourselves, what is that thing? Another way to think about it is, what are we more dependent on than God? The real heart of the matter, though, is what is God asking you to fast from? It doesn't have to be a certain thing, it doesn't have to be for a certain amount of time. Let God speak into that. What we know, though, for sure, is that fasting is an intentional withholding of something that God's asked you for a certain time and purpose. Although the answering of what is fasting might have already dipped into answering our question, why should we fast? I do believe there's more to that question, and we're going to look at that after our commercial break. But while we're away, we're going to break out into groups and discuss some questions just to make sure some of this is starting to sink in. So here are our questions. Which guest did you relate to most? What's been your exposure to fasting? Our second question is, what's your starting point? Do you find yourself more in the camp of, I don't need to do this, it's irrelevant for me? Or are you on the other end where you think this is somehow a way for you to be in more right standing with God, or is something that you need to do to be closer to God? I just think it's important that we figure out what our starting point is. And simply the last question is, what's standing out so far? So we're going to spend 5 minutes now discussing these questions, and we'll be back after these commercial messages.
Go down to Jeff.
No.
Welcome back. One moment while I just gonna do one quick check on something. We'll get back to the talk. That's what we should have the first time.
Welcome back to Pathways. Now that we know our starting points, my prayer is that as we dive a little deeper into why we should fast, that the invitation from Jesus becomes clear on what he's trying to say to you. So, why do we fast? The answer is without a doubt found in the Living Scriptures. There are lots of accounts where fasting takes place, but today I want to look at 3 specific accounts with you. But first, before we get to them, I'd like to welcome our resident storyteller, Rona. Our first account comes from the life of David found in 2 Samuel. Rona, would you please read this for us?
This comes after Nathan has just rebuked David, and David confesses his guilt and is aware of the consequences of his actions. The account is told in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 15 through 20. After Nathan returned to his home, the Lord sent a deadly illness to the child of David and Uriah's wife. David begged God to spare the child. He went without food and lay all night on the bare ground. The elders of his household pleaded with him to get up and eat with them, but he refused. Then on the 7th day, the child died. David's advisors were afraid to tell him. He wouldn't listen to reason while the child was ill, they said. What drastic thing will he do when we tell him the child is dead? When David saw them whispering, he realized what had happened. Is the child dead? He asked. Yes, they replied, he is dead. Then David got up from the ground, washed himself, put on lotions, and changed his clothes. He went to the tabernacle and worshipped the Lord. After that, he returned to the palace and was served food and ate.
It's a tragic story that ends in the death of David's son. But David wasn't really fasting to change an outcome. He was fasting to change his heart. When David got word that his son had died, he got up, cleaned himself up, and went straight to worship God. I believe David's time of fasting drew him into a deeper intimacy and a greater dependence on God, so that when tragedy struck, his response was to turn towards God and not away from him. So why do we fast? Fasting can deepen our intimacy and grow our dependence on the Lord. Our second account comes from Esther. Rona, would you please read this for us?
This next account comes from Esther chapter 4, verses 15 through 17, shortly after Esther has discovered that the Jews are being threatened with death. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: Go and gather together all the Jews of Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will do the same. And then, though it is against the law, I will go in to see the king. If I must die, I must die. So Mordecai went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him.
In this account, Esther is at her wit's end on what she can do to save her people. She had been placed in a position to do something, but that something felt out of her hands. Her response: she felt led to have her people fast and pray and to wait on the Lord. And it was in this denying of self through fasting that I believe God's Spirit came and worked on the king's heart, that ultimately moved him to have a change of heart, which saved Esther's people. So why do we fast? Fasting is an opportunity for the Spirit to work on our behalf as we trust God. Our last account comes from the life of Paul. Rona, take it away.
His final account comes from Acts chapter 13, verses 2 and 3. One day, as these men were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, Appoint Barnabas and Saul for the special work to which I have called them. So after more fasting and prayer, the men laid their hands on them and sent them on their way.
Did you know that Paul was sent out as a missionary after a period of fasting? It was in the withholding and the waiting that they clearly heard the Spirit speak. And when they heard him speak, they continued to fast to seek further clarity. And it was through this act of fasting that Paul and Barnabas were sent out and commissioned to go as missionaries. So, as we learned in our first segment, fasting is a way to tune our hearts to hear clearly from God, to grow our attentiveness to what he is saying. What I truly love is that all three of these points that I've just demonstrated can be found in one account of Jesus' life. We all know that when Jesus started his public ministry, his first thing that happened was the Spirit actually led him into the wilderness where Jesus fasted for 40 days. And we know that it was in this time that Jesus was tempted by the enemy. But it is clear that in this time of fasting, Jesus' dependence on the Father was deepened. It was clear that an opportunity for the Spirit to work on his behalf was there. And it was clear that Jesus heard from God on how he should respond to the enemy's temptations. What happened? Jesus heard and he was successful. He was victorious over the enemy. So, why do we fast? Because deeper dependence, deeper trust, and deeper clarity all speak to the full life we are promised through Jesus. That's his invitation to us. John 10:10 says, I have come that you may have life, but have life to the full. And I believe with all my heart that fasting is a way that we can experience the full life that Jesus promises us. There is a joy that can be found in the denying of ourselves and humbling ourselves as we fast and seek God. But are we required to do it? No. Does it have to look a certain way? No. Is your right standing with God dependent on it? No. Fasting is simply a clear invitation to you to grow your dependence on God and grow your attentiveness to where he is leading. And guys, God is always going to lead you towards full life. Thank you for joining us tonight on our episode of Pathways. I'm C. Ovid. Good night.
All right, everyone. I really hope you were entertained and you learned something. So I went back and forth. Do we break back out and discuss? But I actually felt more led to allow us just individual space to reflect and seek God. So what we're going to do is we're going to have time of personal reflection. There's a song that's going to be playing, a song that I really love, called Knowing You by Shane and Shane. And these are the things that I want you to think about while we're having this time of reflection. So knowing the invitation to fast is really an invitation for us to grow in greater dependence on God and more attentiveness to what he's saying. Do you accept this invitation? And are you willing to give this pathway a go? So if you answer yes to that question, the next thing I want you to spend time reflecting on is to invite God to speak into what might fasting should look like for you. I hope you heard clearly that it does not have to be from food or drink. It should be the thing that you feel is clouding your mind. And that can be lots of different things. So is there a clear thing that comes to mind that you're relying on more than you are relying on God? Is there something getting in the way of you hearing God's voice? And then if you answered no to that first question, I just want you to press into that. What's God really wanting to say to you if your initial response to that question is no? Ask God, what's the source of my hesitation? And maybe what is something I still need to learn before I feel willing to give it a go? I'm aware that we probably just scratched the surface on this topic, and there's more that we could learn and discuss. And so that's a totally fair point if you feel like I need to learn more before I feel like I would give it a go. So those are the things. So ask God, are you willing to accept this invitation? If it's a yes, ask God what that should look like for you. What's the thing getting in the way? And if it's a no, then really press into that. What's your hesitation, and what might you want to still learn more? I think if you can think about, there's a clear opportunity to give this to go coming up as Lent starts Tuesday, and we're going to share more about that. in a video at some point. But just to say it again, Lent is a perfect time to try this out. So we're gonna go into a time of reflection, listen to this song, and when we come back, Christy's gonna close us up.
All I once held dear, built my life upon. All this world reveals, and wars to own. All I once thought being, I have counted loss, spent in worthless now, compared to this. Knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my Lord, you're the best, you're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord. Now my heart's desire is to know you more, to be found in you, and known as yours, to possess by faith what I could not earn, all surpassing gift of righteousness. Knowing you, Jesus, knowing you, there is no greater thing. You're my all, you're the best, you're my joy, my righteousness, and I love you, Lord. Oh, to know the power of your risen life, and to know you in your suffering, to become like you in
Hey, thanks, Ryan. I want to thank you for your gift of creativity and bit of lightheartedness to bless us tonight. But I'd love, just love that picture of deeper dependence, deeper trust, deeper clarity, and the call to that. And so, yeah, I just wonder if part of our preparation to emerge from lockdown could be really listening to what Jesus says. You know, we firmly believe that discipleship is all about hearing what God is saying and responding to it by faith, believing that He's leading us to full life. And so I just want to say, family, if you felt that tug on your heart that God is saying, come on, trust me, let's give this pathway a go. First, I'd encourage you to speak to someone. Don't do that alone. Someone can pray and support you through it, which I think is really important. Youth, I would say that to you especially. Make sure your parents, make sure a friend, someone that you trust and respect is going to walk that with you. You're not telling them out of pride, are you? But it's just saying, hey, I'm trying to obey and I want to exercise my faith muscles. And so will you stand with me as I do that? So I want to encourage you to do that. But I want to just encourage you to do that as a way to prepare for what God's got for us as we emerge. So can I close us in prayer? And then we will stick on. Feel free to stick around and chat. Anybody needs to specifically chat, call someone up. You know how to get a hold of people. But let's just close in prayer. Yeah, Father, we thank you for this little bit of time. We could just push pause on life and come together on a screen. And we thank you for the gifts of your Spirit. Thank you that you're present with us when we get together. Thank you that you have given the gifts of teaching, especially that in these little times we can hear through you using that gift through someone else. I just love that picture. And we receive what you've spoken to us tonight. I pray that you would give us courage to obey. And I pray for that bit of fear that some might be feeling of, I think God just spoke to me and I want to obey, but I'm scared or I'm nervous. Jesus, I just want to pray for a spirit of peace to come around that, just the confidence that when you speak to us, you're always leading us to life, like Ryan said. So help us to press into life. I pray where there's confusion and frustration and just a big question mark for anyone, I pray, God, that you would bring your peace to that place and a real release of grace that we don't have to figure all of these things out today. This is a journey we're on, and we can keep growing in our learning and our understanding. And so, Father, just help us to hold tight to you as we go and give us the courage to remain community and keep showing up for each other, even when it's difficult. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.